So last year at NIPS, I was slated to give a talk at the Deep RL workshop, and I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about because everything I had prepared, I had already talked about it so many times that I just didn't want to give another talk on it. So I asked Peter for his advice on what I should talk about, and he said that Andrew Ng had given a talk earlier in the conference called "The Nuts and Bolts of Deep Learning," where he sort of went through the flow chart of what you do when you see a new problem, and like if you're overfitting, you regularize, and if you're underfitting, then you use a bigger model, and so on. So Peter suggested to write a talk called "The Nuts and Bolts of Deep RL Research," where I would talk about some of the similar lessons and the tips and tricks for the RL setting. So I put together a talk for that, and actually people seem to like it. So I'll give a slightly updated version of that talk right now. So I'm going to talk about a few different things, some of which are general and sort of apply to RL, using reinforcement learning in general, and some of them pertain to particular classes of methods like policy grading methods. And these are just sort of little tips and tricks for how you get your algorithm to work and what you do day to day. So let's say you have a totally new problem you're trying to solve. Like you have some new task, and you figured out how to, you defined an observation and an action space, and you have your neural network policy or Q function, and you want to start learning how to solve it, but you've never tried it before. Or if you have a new algorithm you're trying to get working that you've never used it before. So what do you do? What's the first thing you do if you have a new algorithm? My first advice would be to use a small problem so you can run a lot of experiments really quickly and do a hyperparameter search. And it's really useful to be able to visualize the learning process in as many ways as possible. So look at the state visitation, how that's evolving over time, and look at how well your value function is fitting, and so on. So I spent a lot of time looking at the pendulum problem where you're trying to swing up a pendulum, because this problem has a 2D state space where it's just the angular velocity of the pendulum, and I would visualize, here's exactly what the value function looks like, here's exactly what the state distribution looks like, and here's how they evolve over time. So I would get a sense for if my algorithm isn't working, is it because it's oscillating in some funny way, or maybe it's just giving a bad fit, or maybe the value function it's learning isn't smooth enough, and so on. So I would say try to visualize everything, and maybe use small problems where you can visualize everything. It's useful to construct toy problems where your idea is going to be the strongest, where you think, okay, if this idea has any possibility of working, it's going to work there. So for example, let's say you're trying to do something with hierarchical reinforcement learning, then construct some problem where there's some kind of obvious hierarchy that it should learn, and you'll be able to tell if it's doing the right thing. Also construct the problems where it's going to be weakest, obviously. And also, as a counterpoint to that, don't overfit your method to some contrived problem. So let's say you've come up with some toy problem where your method is really good. Then don't realize that it's a toy problem, and don't tweak everything to just work on this toy problem perfectly, because it's also pretty useful to have medium-sized problems that you're very familiar with, and you know exactly how fast the learning should be, and what the reward should be at every iteration, and so on. So there are a few problems that I use a lot, like training on Pong, Atari, and the Hopper problem, which is this simulated robot problem with this hopping robot. And I know exactly how fast an algorithm that's working should learn on these problems. So I can it makes it easier to tune things. If you have a new algorithm. Let's say you have a new task. I would recommend just making the task easier until you start seeing some signs of life. you see it learning something. So there are various ways you can make it easier. You can try doing some feature engineering. So your input features, you think that the you think that the policy should be a simple function of your input features. Like let's say you're trying to get Pong to work, and you tried setting it up with the images as input, and you weren't learning anything. Then you can set up the problem where you pass in x, y coordinates as input, and then try running your algorithm. And it's a much simpler function you're trying to learn, so that's much more likely to work. And then you can try to make it harder and harder until you're solving the full problem. Another way you can make it easier is by shaping the reward function. That means if you come up with some reward function that gives you fast feedback on whether you're doing the right thing or not. So let's say we can define one task where we have this reaching robot, and we just give it a reward if it hits the target. So it gets a reward of 1 if it hits the target and 0 otherwise. So that might be hard to learn because you're not getting any feedback as you're flailing around. But we could define a better shaped reward function where it's just distance to target. Then learning is going to be much faster on that problem. There's also the problem on exactly how to turn your problem into a POMDP in the first place. So often it's not clear what your observation feature should be, and it's not even clear what the reward function should be. So, or it's not clear if this problem you're trying to solve is, if it's feasible at all. So let's say you're trying to solve, you have some game or some robotics task or something new, and you want to turn it into a reinforcement learning problem, but you're not sure if this is feasible at all. So the first thing to do is to just visualize a random policy acting on this problem and see what happens. So if the random policy occasionally does the right thing, then there's a high chance that reinforcement learning is going to work. Because a policy gradient method is just going to take this random behavior and it's going to make the good behaviors more likely. So it'll gradually hone in on the good behaviors. Whereas if you're never doing the right thing, then RL isn't going to get any signal that tells it to do the right thing. Sometimes RL is able to learn even though it seems like it's not clear how it's going to learn. Like learning how to walk, it's not clear that should work, but because you would think that you really have to have the whole policy in place before it does anything useful. But as it turns out, you sort of learn to take one step and then fall over, and then take 2 steps and then fall over, and so on until you've got a proper walking gait. Okay, another thing to do is to make sure your observations are usable. Try to look at them as a human and see if you can control the system using the same observations you're giving to the agent. So let's say you're doing some pre-processing on your images. Look at those pre-processed images yourself and make sure you're not losing too much detail when you downsample them, or losing too much or in the color transformations and so on. Another thing to do is you want to make sure that everything is reasonably scaled, so that, for example, it's, as a rule of thumb, you usually want everything to be mean 0 and standard deviation 1 for the observations. And for the rewards, it's a little less obvious, but that's a reasonable heuristic. So you might want to scale it using some kind of filter. I mean, that's another good thing you can do, but if you don't want to mess with some kind of filters on your observations and rewards, what you can do, you can just kind of, if you're allowed to define those yourself, then you might want to just scale them yourself. So what I'd recommend doing is plot histograms of all of your observations and your rewards, and make sure that for each component of the observations and rewards, you've scaled it properly so that it has the right mean and standard deviation and it doesn't have crazy outliers. Okay, another thing to do is you should have some good baselines that you can use whenever you see a new problem. So it's not clear which algorithm is going to work beforehand. So make sure you just have a bunch of well-tuned things that you can run on each problem. Yeah. Okay, the question was if you're going to do some kind of reward normalization, should you do this over your whole training, like all of your training data or just like the recent data? I would, yeah, there's a lot of subtlety there. So I would say use all of your data so far because you're making everything non-stationary if you do some kind of filtering. Actually, I'm going to talk about this at a later slide. So anyway, I would recommend, as just a few baselines, you should have a cross-entropy method, some policy gradient methods, some kind of Q-learning or SARSA type method. There's a lot of code online now that you can use, other people's code that's already written. So you can use, like we have this OpenAI baselines repository, and also RL Lab has a bunch of algorithms. Okay, another thing to do, which people often get tripped up on, especially when they're trying to reproduce published work, is so you implement the algorithm based on the paper, and then it doesn't really learn anything at all. Then you think, oh, maybe is my code like wrong, or what happened? So I would say early on, you might need to run with more samples than expected. So one hyperparameter that you can usually adjust is how big of a batch size to use or how many samples to use. I would say sometimes you should use more samples than you think you're going to need because usually things just work better when you have more samples, almost always. Sometimes when you're trying to reproduce a published paper, you've got it mostly right but not exactly right. Like maybe you haven't scaled everything properly, or there's some really like obscure hyperparameter that you have wrong, and then you just find that the code doesn't learn anything. So then I would say just try to make it work a little bit, and then you can work from there and try to tweak all the hyperparameters to get up to to get fully up to the published performance. But if you want to just get something working at all, often you need to use bigger batch sizes than you thought. Because if your batch size is too small, then the noise will overwhelm the signal and you won't learn anything. So like, for example, for TRPO, I wasn't seeing any learning for a while, and then it turned out it's just because I was using too small of a batch size, and I had to use 100,000 time steps of a batch for the batch size. For Atari, for DQN, the hyperparameters that were found to be best where you update every 10,000 time steps, you update your Q function every 10,000 time steps, and you have a 1 million time steps in your replay buffer, which is a lot. Okay, so now I'll talk about some guidelines for the ongoing development and tuning process, as opposed to the initial process of I have a totally new problem or a new algorithm that I want to see some signs of life on. Let's say you get something working. I would recommend looking how sensitive your algorithm is to every hyperparameter. And if it's too sensitive, it's not actually a robust algorithm, and you shouldn't be happy with it. You probably just got lucky on that one problem. And it's actually kind of possible to have a method that is a fluke, and it works in one way in one problem because of some funny dynamics, but then it doesn't work in general, so you kind of have to, it needs some serious improvements. So that's, okay, there's also a few things you can look at to see actually I'm going to talk about more of these kind of diagnostics a little later, but there are some indicators that'll tell you that if your algorithm is working, besides just looking at the final performance. But look for other indicators that are going to tell you that your optimization process is kind of healthy. This is going to vary based on the algorithm, but for example, you can look at whether your value function is actually accurate, like whether it's actually predicting returns well. You can look at how big the updates are in terms of some either parameter space or the output space. Standard diagnostics for deep networks, like you can look at norms of gradients and so on. Okay, one thing that takes some discipline but is very useful is to have a system for continually benchmarking your code. And that includes all of your code, not just the one thing you're tuning right now, because often it's easy to tune your algorithm to work well on one problem and then mess up the performance on other problems. And it's really easy to overfit on single problems when you're just adjusting hyperparameters. So I would really recommend having some kind of benchmark you can run frequently, and some kind of battery of benchmarks that you run occasionally. Along the similar lines of like overfitting, of sort of reading too far into noise or overinterpreting noise, it's really easy to just to think you're improving your algorithm or you're making it worse, but really you're just seeing random noise. So you can see 7 different tasks. These are the Jim Mujoko tasks, like half cheetah and hopper and so on. And you have 3 different algorithms here, the red one, the green one, and the blue one. And you can see, okay, we can see that the performance is a little different on all the problems, but it looks like the red, let's see, does the green, which one looks like the best? Well, it kind of varies by problem. Like the blue one looks better on this problem, and the red one is worse on this problem, and so on. But as it turns out, these are all the exact same algorithms and just random seeds, different random seeds. So it's easy to imagine that you're just looking at one of these problems and you see that blue curve and you get really excited and you think you found some huge improvement to your algorithm, but it's really that you just got a lucky seed that one run. So yeah, really you've got to run your algorithm multiple times and average. And even if you're averaging over a lot of seeds, like even if you had like 20 seeds here, there's still a pretty big error bar. So it's, yeah, that makes it particularly hard. I mean, I'd recommend having like multiple tasks and multiple seeds. And if you don't do that, then you're probably just overfitting, unless you see a really drastically large improvement. Another thing to do is it's easy to keep adding little modifications to your algorithm until it gets really complicated, and then you're not sure. And then you think you have this really complicated algorithm which is perfect, but it turns out that most of the things you did are unnecessary because some of the tricks substitute for each other. This is often true because a lot of tricks help because they're like normalizing things in a better way or improving your optimization, like making your optimization less susceptible to like big spikes. I don't know, a lot of different modifications you make have similar effects, so often you can remove them and simplify your algorithm, and this is pretty important. So like especially with regard to changes that do whitening, these kind of all substitute for each other and also substitute for changes to your optimization algorithm. And yeah, I would simplify things because then it's more likely that your insights will generalize to other problems. And also, lastly, it's pretty useful to automate your experiments because otherwise you're going to end up spending all your whole day just watching your code print out numbers. And it's actually really, it's really tempting to spend all day doing that. But I would, I mean, especially if you need to run multiple random seeds, then then you really need to get your workflow down so that you're automating this process and launching lots of experiments at the same time. So I'd recommend just getting set up with one of these cloud computing services so you can just launch experiments on remote instances and pull the results back when you're done. Is there a question?
So you can launch lots of experiments on platforms. Do you have recommendations for a framework to keep track of experiments?
Oh yeah, question is, do you have a recommendation on what framework to use to keep track of your experiment results? I personally use no framework at all, and I just have like IPython notebooks and scripts that collect a bunch of data that's stored in various log files. So I just have scripts that read all my log files and plot them. I don't use, some people like having databases and stuff where they store all their hyperparameter results, but I don't find it necessary personally. Okay, so now let's see, I'm going to talk about general tuning strategies for RL, and then after that I'll talk about some specific tuning strategies for different classes of algorithms. Okay, so one thing is whitening or standardizing your data. So if your observations have unknown range, you should definitely standardize them. I would do that by computing a running estimate of the mean and the standard deviation, and then just z-transforming it like this. And I would recommend computing the mean and the standard deviation over all data you've seen so far, not just your recent data, because otherwise you're effectively changing your data in some way that the policy doesn't know about. Like you have that your policy grading algorithm doesn't know about. Like your policy grading algorithm is actually optimizing some objective. So then if you just go and change the problem out from under it, then you're often going to make things a lot worse. Like if you rescale your observations, then your optimization algorithm didn't know about that, so you might just collapse the performance. So that's why I would recommend using your whole, all of your data from the start of time, so that at least it's going to slow down over time how fast your scalings are changing. So yeah, that's what I would recommend doing with the observations. And for the rewards, I would recommend rescaling it but not shifting them, because that affects the agent's will to live. So if you shift the mean reward, that'll affect how long it wants to survive. You're actually changing the problem. Okay, yeah, you might also want to try to standardize prediction targets in the same way, though that's a little more complicated to do.
Your thoughts on PCA widening?
Okay, yeah, so the question is, what about PCA widening instead of just this element-wise scaling? Yeah, that could definitely help. I haven't experimented with that, but yeah, that could help. It's hard to predict with neural nets if it's going to help or not, because they seem to be pretty good at disentangling things. I know that if you have things that are terribly scaled, like they're from negative 1,000 to 1,000, and other coordinates are from negative 0.1 to 0.1, then it's going to be slow for learning. So this kind of scaling helps a lot, even though you have neural networks. Okay, there's some parameters that are really generally important, like discount factor. That determines whether you're, how far away you're doing credit assignments, so whether you're paying attention to effects that are delayed by a certain time. So if your discount is gamma equals 0.99, then you're basically ignoring effects that are more delayed by 100 time steps. So you're kind of short-sighted. That gamma is controlling your short-sightedness, and you might want to actually look at how long that corresponds to in real time. So usually in reinforcement learning, you're sort of discretizing time in a certain way. And it's worth paying attention to, like, is that 100 time steps like 3 seconds of real time or what? And what happens during that time? Also note that if you have TD lambda kind of methods for either for value function estimation or for policy gradient methods, you can get away with using a gamma that's really close to 1, like 0.999. And things aren't going to go unstable, because if you have a lower lambda like 0.9, then that's going to make it so the algorithm is still stable even though gamma is really close to 1. Okay, so as I mentioned, you might want to, in practice, we're usually discretizing some continuous time system. So then it's worth seeing if the problem can actually be solved at this discretization level. So for example, in a game, let's say you're doing frame skip, meaning that you repeat the action multiple times. As a human, can you control it at this rate? Or is it just impossible to control? Is it just like you're doing the action too many times in a row and you have too slow responses to control it? And I would also just look at what the random exploration looks like. And if you make sure that you're exploring, like the discretization is going to determine like how far your Brownian motion goes, because if you're doing the same action many times in a row, then you're going to then you're going to tend to explore further. So it's worth just looking at what the random exploration does and choosing your time discretization in a sensible way so that it does interesting things. Question?
Like take for example the simple EQ. How would you start what if you follow in general speed to come up with a combination of hyperparameters? How do you start with that?
Yeah, so the question is, if you have a DQN, how would you get started, like tuning all the hyperparameters? Actually, I'm going to talk about DQN pretty soon. So yeah, I'll get to that. Okay, also look at the episode returns very closely. Don't just look at the mean, look at the minimum and the maximum. So the maximum, especially if you have a deterministic system, if you have a certain maximum return, that's basically something that your policy can hone in on pretty straightforwardly, because if you just do that every time, then you're going to increase your mean return to that level. So it's useful to look at the max return to see if your policy is ever doing like the right thing according to that max return, or if it's just kind of stuck and it's never discovering the high return strategy. Also look at the episode length, which is sometimes more informative than the episode reward. Because sometimes, well, yeah, I won't go into details on that. If you have a game, it might mean that you might be losing every time, so you're never seeing yourself win, but the episode length will tell you if you're losing slower. So you might see an improvement in episode length at the beginning, but not in reward. Okay, for policy gradient, there are specific strategies, or there are specific diagnostics that are really helpful. So look at the entropy really carefully. If your entropy is going down too fast, that means your policy is becoming deterministic and it's not going to explore anything. So be careful. And also, if it's not going down, your policy is never going to be that good because it's always really random. So you can sort of alleviate this issue by using an entropy bonus or a KL penalty. So by stopping yourself from changing the probability distribution too fast, as a side effect, you also prevent the entropy from going down too fast when you use the KL penalties. Also look at the KL as a diagnostic, look at how big of an update you're doing in terms of KL divergence. If your KL is 0.01, that's a pretty small update, but if it's a 10, that's a really big update. Question?
How do you measure entropy in the policy?
Oh yeah, question is, how do you measure entropy? So if you have, for most policies, you can compute the entropy analytically. So if you have a discrete action space, then you usually can just compute it analytically. And if you have a continuous policy, usually you're using a Gaussian distribution or something, so you can compute the differential entropy analytically. So here we're talking about entropy in action space. So the average over state space of the action space entropy. What you actually might care about even more is the entropy in state space, but you have no hope at actually calculating that, except maybe to do some really crude approximation of it. Okay, yeah, so KL is really useful. Look at explained variance, whether your value function is actually a good predictor of the returns, or if it's just worse than predicting nothing. So if you just predict zeros, then your explained variance is 0. But sometimes if you have some neural network that's predicting, then you find that it's actually negative because it's overfitting or it's just noisy and it's not doing anything useful. So that probably means you need to tune some hyperparameters so that your neural network's actually predicting better than the constant predicting 0. Question? Okay, yeah, question is, why does the KL spike give you a loss in performance? Well, it doesn't always be it's not always a loss in performance. Sometimes it's a gain in performance, but in practice, it's usually a loss in performance because usually the approximation that your policy gradient is just taking you way outside the region where your local approximation to the policy performance is accurate. So you're probably just overshooting. If you take your policy and you take a really big step in any direction, you're probably making it worse. So usually if you take a big step, you're getting worse. If you have a convex function, if you take a big step in any direction, you're probably going to make it worse. Let's see. Okay, initialize your policy. That's pretty important, more important than in supervised learning because that determines what data you're going to see initially and you're going to learn from at the beginning. So I would recommend initializing the final layer to be either 0 or really small, so that at least you have the maximum you sort of explore randomly at the beginning, like maximally randomly at the beginning, as opposed to having some kind of policy that has a strong opinion on the right thing to do, which is based on no information at all. Okay, that's for policy gradient. For Q learning, so a few things. One is, okay, often it helps to have a really big replay buffer, and to be able to do this, you need to be a little careful about memory usage, so it's worth putting in the extra effort to do that. Learning rate schedules are often quite helpful here in practice, as are exploration schedules. So in DQN, you're usually using epsilon greedy, and it often helps to play with the schedule on that. Also, it converges pretty slowly, and it has a mysterious warm-up period at the beginning often. So sometimes you just, so I actually have a lot of admiration for the authors who originally got this, the people who got this to work originally, because they had to just let their code run for a while before it did anything. So you have to have a lot of patience or a lot of bravery to do that. Okay, this is just miscellaneous advice for not necessarily for tuning algorithms, but just for personal development. So I recommend reading older textbooks and theses, not just the latest conference papers, because often they're a more dense source of useful information, whereas each conference paper just has one idea. Okay, yeah, don't get too stuck on problems, because often you actually have a legitimately good algorithm, but it has like some flaws, so it might fail miserably at some easy problem. So in RL, there's some like simple problems like cart pull swing up, where you have this stick and you're trying to swing it up by moving the cart around. And this problem, like you might have a great algorithm, but it's gonna, but like some of the state-of-the-art algorithms are gonna fail on that problem unless you really tune them carefully. And that's just because maybe it's not exactly the right problem to start to, I mean, maybe like the thing that makes this problem hard is not the thing that your algorithm is doing that's interesting. So you might have like come up with a better policy gradient method, but still it'll converge to the same local minimum on that swing up problem, and you're not going to fix that problem. So I would say just don't get too stuck on a single problem that your method fails on. And often, like maybe the ultimate algorithm will solve all of these problems, but we're not there yet, so you might as well just try to improve in some like decently large subset of problems. So also, like one funny thing is that DQN performs pretty poorly on a lot of problems, especially with continuous control. I think it does, I mean, for cart pull, it probably solves it pretty well with a reasonable amount of tuning, but some of the other like fairly small continuous control problems it fails on. But that doesn't mean it's it's a bad algorithm, because it solves a different problem extremely well. So yeah, I would say just these things aren't, at least right now, it's not going to, you shouldn't expect to be able to solve everything with the same method without any tuning. Also, techniques from supervised learning often don't transfer over to reinforcement learning. So, so don't be surprised if you find that. I guess that's not, I said this slide was going to be about personal development. That's not about personal development, but yeah. I guess this is just a grab bag of miscellaneous advice. So, yeah, so like batch norm, a lot of people look at what people are doing in RL and they think, why aren't you using batch norm or dropout or big networks? Why are you using like 2 layers of 64 units? And it's not like people didn't think of trying these other things. They tried them, and then they found that those other like architectures and methods don't actually help here. I mean, if you figure out how to make batch norm and dropout actually help in RL, that'll actually be really great, and that'll be a big development. But yeah, I don't know. It's not totally straightforward. All right, that's all. Thank you. Okay, I have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, you mentioned that non-regression, things cannot be used for a long time, and then you have PS5. And it might take a week or so for me to reach that point.
Mhm.
But sometimes my algorithm might be wrong. So when do I stop? I mean, when is the right window to say, okay, let's move on, probably this is not working?
Yeah, so the question is, how long do you wait until you've decided that your algorithm isn't going to work, either because your code is wrong or it's just too hard? I don't have a good general answer to that. I think the problem is worse for some algorithms than others. I'd say for policy gradient methods, you don't see that burn-in period as much. Like often, if it's going to learn, it'll learn it at the beginning. But that's not always true either. I mean, sometimes it will kind of take some time to get into the right numerical regime. So I don't have general advice. I would say you have to just, I would say go back and start with the easy problems, and you'll get some intuition about whether you should expect a burn-in period or not, where it's not learning anything. Let's see, I want to get some people in the back because, no, okay. Oh yeah, question is, do I use unit tests? I use unit tests for code where it's doing a very particular mathematical thing that you can actually write a test for. Like, let's say I'm computing the KL divergence, then I'll write a test to check, I don't know, there are various ways of testing it. And it's easy to get those things wrong. Like you have, I don't know, you're off by a constant or something. Yeah, I write tests for things where it's there's a very well-defined correct thing to do. It's harder to write it for an algorithm where it has a lot of different moving parts, where it's not clear how fast it should learn, and there's some randomness involved. So if you try to write a test saying, I should be at performance 100 after this many iterations, it might fail just out of random noise. But yeah, I think probably unit tests are a good idea.
Do you have guidelines on matching RL tasks with RL algorithms, like when is policy gradient a better idea than value iteration or after gradient?
Oh yeah, so the question is, do I have guidelines on matching the algorithm to the task, like when to use policy gradients versus a value iteration style method? It's hard to give some general guidelines. I think people have found that, and the guidelines I give you might just be kind of historical accidents, like someone got this to work here and this to work there. So I think certainly if you don't care that much about sample complexity, policy gradient methods are probably the way to go. If you don't care about sample complexity or using off-policy data, then policy gradient methods are probably the safest bet because I don't know, it's more understandable exactly what it's doing. It's just doing gradient descent. Whereas Q-learning, it's a little bit indirect what it's doing. So it in practice is more finicky. Yeah, if you do care about sample complexity though, or need off-policy data, then Q-learning is usually better. Or if you like sample complexity is relevant if your simulator is expensive, of course. I would also say that people have found that DQN and relatives have worked well on game-like tasks with images as input, whereas policy gradient methods work better on the continuous control tasks, like these robotic locomotion problems, though that might not be fundamental. It might be more of a historical accident. Let's see.
You just look more at old textbooks.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recommendations?
Oh yeah, recommendations on older textbooks. Let's see, there's like Bertsekas's books. That's approximate optimal control and why am I blanking on the name? Optimal control and dynamic programming, something like that. Sutton and Bardo is a good one to read. Puderman has a textbook, kind of a classic textbook on Markov decision processes. That's in the RL space. Then there's books on numerical optimization that are good. And yeah, I'd say obviously the machine learning textbooks have a lot of good material that might be useful in the RL setting too. Oh yeah, can I comment on evolution strategies and the blog post, the OpenAI blog post on it. Let's see, do you have any specific questions about it, or like how it compares? Oh yeah, okay, yeah. So there's a lot of policy grading methods out there, and some of them are quite complicated. So we've had a couple of talks on them so far, like all these different successively more complicated policy grading methods. But then there's this old algorithm called evolution strategies, which is an extremely simple algorithm. And there's a paper by some of my colleagues where it was called Evolutionary Strategies as a Scalable Alternative to Reinforcement Learning, which really meant like to policy grading methods. And they claimed that it worked basically as well as policy grading methods, or at least it's sort of in the same order. Oh, and Peter was one of the authors of that paper. So the claim was that it works like similarly well to policy grading methods. So why should we bother with these policy grading methods if ES works just as well? Well, I think in practice it works. Well, it works, but it works not as well. Like it takes the sample complexity is worse by some constant factor, or it's not clear that it's a constant factor or if this factor scales with the size of the network. But it is significantly slower. And the question is just, what is that constant factor? So is that constant factor like 1, or is it 3, or is it 10, or 100? So that's going to vary between problems. And also that paper had some innovations in exactly how to parameterize the networks and so forth that made everything better numerically, everything better scaled so that ES did work well. But I would say that that it's usually it's usually a pretty decent constant factor slower than policy grading methods, especially the more advanced ones like the PPO and actor. So I think it's not really a clear win in the RL settings where policy gradients work. I think if policy gradients work, it's usually going to be a lot better, and the ES is going to be better on problems where policy gradients aren't going to work for some reason, like if you've got really long time dependencies where the discounts are going to ignore them, then ES might be less sensitive to that. Let's see. I think okay. Last question.
Do you have a favorite hyperparameter optimization framework?
Oh yeah, favorite hyperparameter optimization framework. I've used some of these, and I just like to use uniform random sampling. That works really well. I mean, you just run a bunch of experiments with random hyperparameters, and then you just look at the results the next day and do some regression to figure out which parameters actually mattered. And then you run another experiment with better parameter ranges and so on. So I use the human version of it because often it's just too, it's useful to be able to look at the results yourself too to figure out which parameters actually matter, so you're not wasting a lot of computation because that information transfers between problems. All right.
Thanks, John. Good to see you.